In the last video, we introduced the idea of a request struct into our contract. We're now going to start working on the create request function right here, and we're also going to create our requests array. Remember, just like I said at the end of the last video, this does not create an instance of a struct. It just creates the idea of one. It creates the type inside of our campaign. So to actually create a request and store it inside of our contract, we're going to make an array that specifically holds variables of type request. So let's take care of that first. Back inside of our contract, next to all the other variables that we have defined so far, we're going to make a new array and specify its type as being request. So we're going to do that in a very similar fashion to how we define the array of addresses right here. We'll say request with a capital R, square braces or square brackets, then public, and requests, like so. Notice that we're using a capital R here because we used our capital R to define the struct. By convention, we usually use a capital R whenever we are defining a struct, which is dissimilar to how we usually do all of our type definitions or type annotations. This variable of type array of request is given the name requests. So now anywhere inside of our contract, we could make reference to the requests array. So I could say request.push, and I could push in a new request. I could say give me the first request in there by using the square bracket with index of 0. So in general, it behaves just like an array, but rather than an array of addresses or an array of numbers or whatever else, we are working with an array of requests. Cool, so that looks good. Let's now move on. We're going to start working on our create request function. Now this is going to be called by our manager to create a new spending request. In other words, create a new variable of type request and then add it into our requests array. One thing I want to point out about this function is that we probably only want a manager to be able to call this thing. We don't really want a contributor to be able to call it, and we certainly don't want some random person to call it. Only the manager should be able to create a request. Otherwise, some malicious people might come along and create a bunch of fraudulent requests that try to pay some bad person all the money inside the contract. In other words, we need to make sure that we lock down or restrict access to the create request function. And that definitely sounds very similar, very familiar. If you remember back to our lottery contract, we had put together the pick winner function. And for that, we wrote a modifier, a function modifier, to lock down access to it. So I think that before we even start working on create request right here, we might need to create another function modifier to lock down access to the create request function. When we put together that function modifier on the lottery contract, we only used it in one place. However, I very quickly would get the feeling that we would want to lock down not only create request in this case, but probably also finalize request as well. So in this case, we'll be able to use this modifier probably in more than one location, which would be really nice. All right, so let's do this modifier. In practice, it's going to look basically identical to the one we already put together. Traditionally, we place all of our modifiers directly above the constructor function. We didn't really follow that rule over on our lottery contract, but we are this time around. So right above the constructor function, I'm going to give myself a little bit of space, and then we will create a new modifier called restricted. The code inside this thing is going to be absolutely identical to the restricted modifier that we put together already. So we are going to require that whoever is calling a given function, so message.sender, has the exact same address as whoever had created this contract, which is going to be our manager variable. So we'll require that message.sender is equal to the manager variable. Then remember how a modifier works. The modifier we can kind of imagine is going to take an entire other function and like paste it into the body of this thing. And we mark where we want all that code to be kind of virtually pasted by placing our underscore. So right after the require statement, we'll place underscore semicolon like so. This introduces a modifier called restricted. So now we can take restricted and add it to any given function inside of our contract. So we could add it onto contribute, but that definitely does not make sense. We want anyone to be able to call contribute. We really only want to lock down or restrict access to the create request and finalize request functions. All right, so now that we got the modifier put together, let's take a pause here. We'll come back in the next video and we're going to start working on create request. So quick pause and I'll see you in just a minute.